Hello, my friends. Hello, and welcome once again to stately Vaughan Manor, where it's Mythos Monday. It's Mythos Monday once again. It's been a while since we've had a Mythos Monday, but today we are going to be talking about H.P. Lovecraft. We're going to be talking about a certain edition of H.P. Lovecraft that I like an awful lot, which would be this one, the Arkham House edition, which hangs out right here on my shelf. This is the Arkham House edition of his collected fiction. This is an important set of books because for a long time, this was the way to get all of his work, all of his best work anyway. It's only missing a few things as far as his fiction is concerned. And this is the way to get it for the latter half of the 20th century. Unlike now, when you have like a gazillion editions of H.P. Lovecraft, there wasn't much when I was growing up. There were paperback editions, various paperback editions, but for a nice hardcover set, this was it. That's the only one that was available from Arkham House. So Arkham House was a publisher that was formed specifically to publish the work of H.P. Lovecraft by Donald Wandrei and August Derleth. So they got together and they formed Arkham House. And they published The Outsider and Others. The Outsider and Others by H.P. Lovecraft. That was their initial volume. They published more Lovecraft, and they also published, over time, a bunch of great stuff from writers like Clark Ashton Smith, Robert E. Howard, and later on Ramsey Campbell and Robert Bloch. I mean, they published so many great writers and books, and they have become a legendary publisher for being a publisher of horror, fantasy, and science fiction. Very collectible Arkham House books are now. But in the 1960s, August Derleth edited a series of books, this series of books, the collected fiction of H.P. Lovecraft, and it was the first time you can get almost all of his fiction in one really nice set of books. So it was pretty important, this set. This was kind of the gold standard for years and years. It had some peculiarities, though. There were some interesting things about it. So this set of books, this is how I read Lovecraft for the first time, really. I had read one paperback when I was 13 or 14 years old. It was The Tomb and Other Stories, I believe. And it did not have H.P. Lovecraft's best work in that volume. But it was enough to really intrigue me. I had some difficulties with his style and his vocabulary. I wasn't used to H.P. Lovecraft's kind of archaic style. I certainly had never even heard some of the words that H.P. Lovecraft used. I didn't realize at the time that only H.P. Lovecraft used these words. But I was intrigued. I liked H.P. Lovecraft, even if I didn't completely understand all that I was reading. And I had talked to my stepfather about Lovecraft, and he knew who Lovecraft was. And he ended up picking up this set of books. It must have been in 1988. He picked up the first three, and later on I got the fourth one. They never had dust jackets, my set, unfortunately. And that's unfortunate because there were some pretty nice dust jackets for these books, which I will show you using my magical powers that I gained from the Necronomicon. So, in 1963, this volume came out. And this volume is The Dunwich Horror and Others. Also, this was considered by August Derleth to be H.P. Lovecraft's best stories. And this cover is by Lee Brown Coy. He did the covers for the initial three volumes, this being the first one. Then they came out with At the Mountains of Madness and Other Novels. And this volume had his novel-length stories, including The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath and The Case of Charles Dexter Ward, as well as some other shorter books, or shorter stories. He only wrote 3 novels, but this also had some of his Randolph Carter stories in it, The Silver Key, and some other stuff. And then they came out with Dagon and other macabre tales. Now, this was an interesting set because this had actually a lot of his earlier work in it. And a lot of his Dunsany-inspired work or his Edgar Allan Poe-inspired work. A lot of his earlier stuff you could find in this volume. So Derleth didn't put this set together in chronological order as far as how Lovecraft wrote the stories. He just kind of threw them in there in an interesting order, which we'll get into. So this set came out beginning in 1963 through 1965. But then in 1970, this came out. This is the Horror in the Museum and other revisions. So H.P. Lovecraft, as well as just doing his original work, also revised stories for clients, and that's how he made some of his money. But very often his revised stories were pretty much H.P. Lovecraft stories. He did all the real work with just like an idea or a title. However, there were some other stories that he lightly revised, and so this has a bunch of his revisions. It doesn't have all of them, I don't believe, but it has most of the important ones. And so this 4-volume set was pretty important for the latter half of the 20th century. It was the gold standard of H.P. Lovecraft publications. And it is how I read Lovecraft really for the first time, the majority of his work anyway, and starting with this volume, The Dunwich Horror and Others. And it was such a cool way to read Lovecraft and to discover this writer. First of all, it was my first glimpse of Lovecraft. There was no internet back in the day when I was reading this in 1988. So this is the first time I ever saw Lovecraft, was this photograph. And I loved the font used for the title page. This has an introduction by Robert Bloch. Pretty interesting introduction, actually. And the contents of this volume are interesting. First of all, the very first story in this set is a story called In the Vault, which was written in 1925. In the Vault is not one of H.P. Lovecraft's best stories. However, August Derleth seemed to like it. So he made that the very first story in this set. And it's an okay horror story. It's not gonna, blow your mind. It's kind of like one of the types of stories you'd find in an EC comic. So not bad, but certainly not representative of Lovecraft's work. Now from there we go to Pickman's Model from 1926, which is a really good story. The Rats in the Walls from 1923. You can see we're jumping all around as far as when he wrote these stories. The Outsider from 1921. The Color Out of Space follows that from 1927. The Music of Eric Zahn from 1921. The Haunter of the Dark from 1935, which is actually his last story, the last story that he wrote. The Picture in the House from 1920. The Call of Cthulhu from 1926. The Dunwich Horror from 1928. Cool Air from 1926. The Whisperer in Darkness from 1930. The Terrible Old Man, that's an interesting choice for this volume, from 1920. The Thing on the Doorstep from 1933. The Shadow over Innsmouth from 1931. And The Shadow Out of Time from 1935. Actually, it says 34 through 35 in here because it was serialized. So yeah, an interesting set of books. And a really cool way to read Lovecraft for the first time. The editions that I have are a little different from the original publication though, and that's important. So the original publication by Arkham House had errors as far as the stories. It had a bunch of mistakes and a lot of changes from Lovecraft's original stories. And a lot of these came from the original magazine publications, from Weird Tales and other magazines, where mistakes were made when they originally published these, or there were deliberate editorial changes that Lovecraft did not approve. And then there were further errors made when this Arkham set was published for the first time. In the 1980s, and that's the set that I have, S.T. Joshi, renowned Lovecraft scholar, then a young H.P. Lovecraft scholar, carefully checked the manuscript and the typescript, the surviving manuscripts and typescripts, against the published versions in the Arkham House editions. And he found all of the mistakes, and he corrected them. So the set I have was published beginning in 1985, and it was published through 1989. The last volume, The Horror in the Museum, was published in 89. So in this set of books, he completely corrected all of the mistakes made. Most of them anyway. He has gone over the stories again. He's made some further corrections. But this was pretty important because this had never been done. And so that made this set really important because at the time, in the late 80s and before, all the paperback editions were based on those original Arkham House editions, and in the paperback editions, there were more mistakes. So if you have some of those old paperbacks, you have editions that have stories that have issues as far as the text is concerned. Nowadays, most publishers will use S.T. Joshi's corrected editions. But back in the 80s, that was not the case. So that made this edition important for another reason, because all of the work S.T. Joshi put into correcting the text, for which all of us who love Lovecraft, we owe him a debt of gratitude for that, as well as for everything else S.T. Joshi has done for Lovecraft scholarship. But the initial volume was really interesting. At the Mountains of Madness, this kind of blew my mind, this volume, when I read it for the first time. Because this volume has the dream quest of unknown Kadath. And that, I had never read anything like that. This type of fantasy story. It was just so different from everything that I would have expected from Lovecraft. And very different from the first novel in this collection, At the Mountains of Madness, which was very much a science fiction horror story. And I remember reading that book specifically, starting this volume, and how dry and scientific everything was at the beginning of that story. And some of the descriptions were just so precise. It was interesting. But I remember thinking, man, you have to be a genius to understand some of this stuff. But it was effective because that very level of dry scientific description added to the horror, because then you get to all the fantastic stuff in that story and all the horror stuff, and it just makes that stuff seem more realistic because of the way it was written. It was great. It was a great way to read these stories. And of course it has the case of Charles Dexter Ward, and all of the novels that are in this volume are just so different. And then I got to Dagon and Other Macabre Stories, and reading some of that stuff, some of his fantasy stories that were inspired by Lord Dunsany. I mean, it was just really an interesting way to read these stories for the first time. I really wish I had the dust jackets because they were beautiful. This is the first one, the first dust jacket from the Dunwich Horror and others. And you can see Cthulhu there. This dust jacket was illustrated by Raymond Bayless. And it's just such a cool illustration. You can't see it probably because it's probably small. You're probably looking at this on your phone, but Cthulhu is dropping a little tiny person. A little tiny person's like, ah! But it has kind of a fairy tale quality to it, his set of covers for these books. And this is the second one in particular, his cover from At the Mountains of Madness and other novels. This is clearly from The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath. Great cover. It's just, again, it has that kind of fairy tale / horror quality to it that is just beautiful. And I really, really wish I had these covers, man, because they're great. And then this one, Dagon and Other Macabre Stories, or Other Macabre Tales. This is a great cover with this creepy Lovecraftian beastie crawling out of his cave. Such a great cover. The last one I actually had. I got The Horror in the Museum and Other Revisions last. I bought that one myself to go along with the set. And since the other books in my set didn't have dust jackets, I took the dust jacket off and have since lost it, unfortunately. So that sucks because this dust jacket was pretty cool. And the revision volume is actually pretty cool, this one, because of what's in it. You have a little example of his revisions there on the title page. And you have primary revisions and secondary revisions. Secondary revisions being revisions that he didn't do too much with, including the last one in here, which makes the whole volume worth getting anyway. This is R.H. Barlow's The Night Ocean. This is pretty much all Barlow, with maybe some light touches by Lovecraft. Barlow was a good friend of H.P. Lovecraft, a sensitive and talented individual who died far too young. And this is a really good story from Barlow. But he also has, like I said, a lot of these revisions in here are pretty much pure Lovecraft. But not all of them are all that great. Although The Curse of Yig from 1928 is a great story and definitely belongs in a Lovecraft set because that one's really good. Can't really say the same for some of the others like Medusa's Coil from 1930. That one was particularly bad. You have The Electric Executioner, which was just weird, from 29. You have The Mound, which is serialized 1929 through 1930. The Mound has points of real excellence, but there were also some things about it which were not so great. Particularly the pace of the story seems to be off. But there are some genuinely nightmarish things in that story, so it's well worth reading. Eventually, there was a third set of covers for this set of books that was published in 2001 from Tony Patrick. I don't like them as much, but I'll show them to you. Here is the first one, The Dunwich Horror. I don't like this nearly as much as the earlier cover from Bayless. And then you had this one from At the Mountains of Madness. I like this one an awful lot. This actually, I have to say, this is clearly an image from The Case of Charles Dexter Ward. Then you have this one. This is the Dagon and Other Macabre Tales. And then finally, you have his book of revisions, The Horror in the Museum and Other Revisions. And I actually like this one an awful lot too, but I have to say I like that original set of covers better. But this was an important set of books. It was kind of foundational as far as Lovecraft scholarship is concerned and everything that came after. S.T. Joshi came out with his own collected edition that was published by Barnes & Noble that has some further corrections and actually has everything published in the order that the stories were written. That is probably a more valuable and instructive way to read the stories. if you're really interested in Lovecraft's progression as a writer. But I have to say, I have a soft spot in my heart for these books, and they were very, very important for H.P. Lovecraft and H.P. Lovecraft scholarship, and for those of us who love Lovecraft's work. And I've probably said enough for today. I've gone on at length again. Catch me next time here at Stately Fawn Manor.